term dead game is dying. In this modern world, nothing and nobody makes sense, including most words that most people throw around, such as the term dead game. I guess we have to define it, but from what I would gather, a dead game means a multiplayer game that has no players at all, or little to no players, or a really low number of players to the point where you're struggling to find matches, or you're just fighting the same people over and over again fairly frequently. And the first Google definition seems to agree with that, but now the term has basically been used for multiplayer games that people just don't like. People of course have the right to not like something, but I don't think that justifies the term objectively being misused by a landslide in certain instances. I'll start with the two biggest heavy hitters I know of that get called a dead game. Dead by Daylight and Overwatch 2. Dead by Daylight being a super original asymmetrical online PvP horror game, including multiple horror brands, one of my personal favorite games at that, and Overwatch being a hero shooter that released in 2016 and ended up being the 9th best selling game ever, despite the narrative grifting YouTubers like to put out on live service games being a bad practice in concept, while they try to weaponize failures like Concord and Suicide Squad as a strawman point against the entire genre, despite the many successes that outweigh those. A mostly live service game like Battlefront is a top selling Star Wars game, by the way. But anyway, my point in bringing this up is that games released in 2016 like Dead by Daylight and Overwatch still hover around the top 10 to top 30 at being the most played games on Steam charts ever. And I've seen the term dead game be thrown around constantly for those two games, despite these numbers objectively saying otherwise, for games that will soon be over a decade old at that. Bear in mind that these Steam charts only include the player base of people playing on PC via Steam, so take these numbers with a grain of salt, as these games could have even more players than they seem, or a chart that could look much worse than it is, such as Battlefront 2015 having under 40 players on Steam, when I know it to have at least well over 200 on console as a generous lowball. But anyway, I'm not saying that player count is the be or end all of quality, as I didn't really mess with Overwatch 1 or 2 despite the time I put into it due to buddies of mine getting me on the game, as I find the gameplay of Overwatch to be repetitive due to matches playing in a very linear fashion with very little differing experiences that make a match play differently than the match I played prior. Hence why I enjoy other hero shooters more, despite them having a much lower player base, like Paladins, where there's more variety with number of characters and types of matches that are played with more styles of play to be seen, or the upcoming Marvel rivals that may surpass Overwatch with unique experiences like Spider-Man and team-up moves, or hell, even the objectively mechanically flawed Battlefront 2 just because of more variety in game modes. But despite these negative things I just said about Overwatch, I still have the mentally mature, well-articulated mindset to not incorrectly call Overwatch a dead or dying game when the stats objectively say otherwise. I guess that's really the main mindset of these immature, brain-dead people. They themselves just don't like a game for varying reasons, and instead of just saying that this game isn't really their cup of tea, or stating their problems with said game, like I just did with Overwatch, they instead call the game dead, or bitch about live service games when they barely play any live service games to justify their criticism. It's like seeing a guy who doesn't like burritos put out a negative burrito review about a food item he doesn't enjoy regardless of how it's made. I see this shit happen with Dead by Daylight all the time. Wah wah wah, I don't like this game. I had a bad match against a C-tier killer, like the clown. This is why this game that has been out for around a decade is dying. So many dog shit videos like these. Dead by Daylight commentary channels are 90% trash anyway. Even if they were right about Dead by Daylight and Overwatch being dead or dying games, I don't think it would be that much of an insult given that these games lasted over a decade, even if their bullshit quote was true. I guess you can say that player bases have dipped, such as more people playing Overwatch 1 than 2, but I still don't think that fits the definition of dead or dying, when the game is still in the top 30 overall games played. The games that are the least dead get called dead the most, like COD, Apex, and even PUBG, etc. I don't even mess with all those games myself, but let me do the thinking for you and correct your speech by saying that the game is just dead to you, and not actually dead. But anyway, let's take some more nuanced examples of games that are called dead, that I don't think are really dead, despite their numbers not being super high or super low. There's no bigger example of a player-based drop-off than MultiVersus, or heck, even Fall Guys. But I still would not define that as dead when both of those games are hovering around 2,000 players, especially in the case of MultiVersus, as that game only requires 4 player at most across 3 game modes. Now, not to say that MultiVersus is thriving or anything, as that is lower than it could or should be, due to various blunders of Warner Brothers in a game where the core gameplay is still fun and solid, as I love playing as a Joker, but that game is still not what should be called a dead game, despite Brawlhalla passing it up, even though MultiVersus had an all-time high when it was briefly the most played fighting game ever. This may not be a top 100 played game, but once again, these examples are not the definition of dead, dwindling at worst. I guess it's time to get into some games that actually get close to being actual examples of semi-dead games, starting with the short-lived NetherRealm fighting games. I will admit that the fighting game genre isn't something I mess with too much, but Injustice 2 was one of the games I actually sunk a decent amount of time into, beyond MultiVersus, and it only took a little over a year to just be running into the same few people over and over again, and I've heard that it's a similar enough story for every Mortal Kombat game that came out after. I personally don't mess with NetherRealm games anymore after Injustice 2, as I don't really want to spend around $100 to get every character near release, while taking a decent amount of time to learn characters only for the game to not last over a year, as opposed to Dead by Daylight, which can be an investment to learn and buy things for, but the game is something that actually has lasted for nearly a decade. Nearly every fighting game that isn't Smash Bros or a Japanese fighting game like Tekken or Street Fighter seems to suffer from that issue, to be honest, such as Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl, that I actually did have fun with despite that game also being very short-lived. But yeah, beyond fighting games, I have other examples of dead or close to dead games I've messed with and still mess with, although these games are mostly non-crossplay. Going as far back as the Xbox 360 days, where my main buds Flanus and Hadesgate used to play Batman Arkham Origins online for the Xbox 360 from 2014 till 2018ish, since Xbox's backwards compatibility allowed people to play on the Xbox One before the servers got taken down by unknown causes. That game had less than 100 or even less than 30 players after the first year or much later, and we still had fun on it. It was the Xbox 360 days though, where, online gaming wasn't as mainstream, as I believe it was only COD, Halo, and Minecraft that had significant player counts at the time, with very little exceptions. Beyond Xbox 360 games though, we have Friday the 13th, which I had a blast on despite its player base now being fairly low in tandem with the servers that are soon to be shut down, sadly. Or games like EA Battlefronts being played past the year 2020, like 2015's Battlefront, where I play the Heroes vs Villains mode and DLC modes from time to time, even though the player base is probably less than 300 roughly guessing. Keep in mind that I'm playing on the Xbox, hence why it has more players than Steam's mere 30ish or so. Then there's Battlefront 2, which is in a slightly better yet similar spot, as you can't find matches on other game modes at certain times of day. The Crash Bandicoot multiplayer games that probably have less than 100 people playing, even though those multiplayer games deserve better and are mechanically top tier, but people just play the games that marketing tells them to play most of the time, despite gamers claiming they want something fresh and new, while looking past the Crash games and various other innovative titles that have no other games that play like them at all. Crash Team Racing doesn't just play like Mario Kart. Nobody who's a free thinker who actually played Crash Team Racing significantly has said that. But anyway, the point is, these are actual examples of games that are close enough to possibly be called dead. Especially examples like the Butchered Battlefront Classic Collection, where there's only 20 tops players in the OG Battlefront 2, or the very first Battlefront having next to no players at all, literally zero. Thank goodness me and my buddy played a few matches on Xbox on the first Battlefront near launch before the numbers started to literally hit zero. when it was one of the most pre-ordered PS5 titles. Beyond legitimate instances like the Battlefront Classic Collection though, most of the time somebody throws around the term dead, it's mostly a game that doesn't fit that definition, such as Overwatch and Dead by Daylight as said before. I know some people may use the term ironically, but I don't think it should be used ironically when the games that are being mentioned are in the top 30 played overall games, as said before once again. Why can't people make sense and just say they personally don't like things, whether it be multiplayers as a whole or certain games, instead of illogically throwing around these big false information terms in the instances where they clearly don't apply, just for the sake of views or lack of original thought and their lack of ability to comprehend their own thoughts and reasons. Maybe I'm just too much of an MLG grandmaster at articulation, but it's not that hard to articulate yourself. Like, I'll use one of my personal distastes as an example. I personally don't like most of the fighting game genre, as I don't really care to go through and memorize an entire move list and its frame data when the list could be as long as a chapter book in the cases of Japanese fighting games like Tekken or Street Fighter, only to have that cycle sorta repeat when another one of those games come out next year. Unlike Dead by Daylight, that has a fairly huge skill ceiling as well, but it's a game that has lasted more than a decade for it to be worth my while. Now, I won't try to fully insert myself into those fighting game communities when the likes of the genre isn't my cup of tea for the most part. I won't go around throwing terms like dead or dying games when such terms don't apply to certain fighters I don't play, like Tekken, Street Fighter, and Brawlhalla. I won't call it dead just because I don't like it. Like, these losers can easily correct themselves and just say dead to me, but no, they don't have the balls or brain power to articulate themselves like I just did. They just copy other takes from content creators who misuse flashy terms like dead game. The world is just full of idiots that are incapable of thinking for themselves. Idiots that just roll with the headlines. It's why media and media criticism sucks ass, such as Angry Joe's Battlefront review where he knocked the games for their campaign quality when the multiplayer was clearly the main focus. Just like the very first original Battlefront that barely had a story mode at all. Shit like this is why we get dumb brain-dead single-player games that don't challenge the players at all, such as Spider-Man, where the game swings itself and tells you if it's safe or unsafe to do stealth takedowns. But whatever, with my long run on this channel, I'm starting to discover that you cannot teach independent thought 99% of the time. I can't unprogram fucking bots. Someone just has independent thought, or they don't. It can't be taught, as most humans are too stubborn to learn, even in the face of them being up against objective cases. So with that in mind, why don't you guys start hive thinking like you guys already do, but except you guys start hive thinking to my thoughts instead. If one cannot properly think for themselves, the least they could do is be smart enough to copy off the guy with the correct answers of what's mostly objective cases, as opposed to all the other takes they copy off of other shitty YouTubers, such as calling games dead when those games are within the top 30 overall played games, or various other bot copied and pasted takes I've delved into, whether it be non-important gaming fictional matters or more serious non-fictional issues, where people would still copy their takes off of illogical, contradictory sources. I can explain things to you, but I can't understand them for you, unless you retire your brain and give the keys to someone more qualified, such as the supreme intelligence known as myself, instead of leaving those keys in what's clearly been shown to be drunk hands. But seriously, every time someone copies an opinion or take, it's usually an opinion or take that's nearly objectively wrong, such as what I've just delved into. I'll put it into words that 99% of people won't understand, but the solution here is to truly think for yourself, and if you can't, then copy better notes off of me.